Man, the last 12 or so months has been an absolute roller coaster for fans of Mario RPGs, hasn't it? If you had told me at the start of 2023 that by the end of 2024 we would have new installments of every pillar of Mario RPG brought to Switch, I would not have believed you. A Super Mario RPG remake? Yeah, I can kinda see that happening. Square has been doing a lot of remakes recently, so Nintendo would probably just let them do one. But that alongside a remake of Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door and an entirely new game in the Mario and Luigi franchise as well, I'd have thought you were insane. There's no way Nintendo would do that. But of all three of these miracle titles, the one that I thought was going to be the least likely would be a new Mario and Luigi game. To say that this series has been struggling over the last 10 years or so would be a huge understatement. It went from Bowser's Inside Story selling almost 5 million copies, the highest of any Mario RPG ever, to its remake a decade later selling so little that we don't even have concrete numbers. We just know that it's very likely one of the lowest selling Mario games ever. Sadly, that remake in particular failing was the absolute worst case scenario for the franchise's developer, Alpha Dream. They had been struggling for a while, basically ever since Dream Team in 2014, and in the wake of that remake flopping, they weren't able to keep themselves afloat and had to shut down in 2019. This was pretty shocking, even for someone who didn't really vibe with the Mario and Luigi series at the time. The fact that the studio behind one of Nintendo's most beloved sub-series not only closed down, but shuttered so abruptly was a bit of a gut punch, and it did worry me. With Alpha Dream going defunct, I and many other people figured that the Mario and Luigi series would go down with them. Like, how could it not? Nintendo is a business, and like any business, they aren't going to put a lot of time and effort into something that has only shown signs of failure in recent memory. They famously almost killed off the Fire Emblem series, and it was only saved by Awakening's monstrous success. So in the 5 years since Alpha Dream's closing, it was largely just accepted that Mario and Luigi was probably dead, and we'd never see anything from this series again. That is, at least until earlier in 2024, where their annual June Direct started out with a bang. Not only was Mario and Luigi not dead, but its revival act wasn't even going to be in the same vein as Super Mario RPG or Paper Mario. This wasn't going to be a remake of an old game, they weren't playing it safe here. This was an entirely new experience. Now, it's really hard to explain how I felt seeing this reveal. Unlike most people who are really excited to see Mario and Luigi come back, who experienced it during its prime, I'm a relative newcomer to this series. Before 2023, I hadn't beaten a single one of these games, but by the end of the year, I had beaten all of them multiple times and considered myself a full-blown fan. So it was pretty surreal to be able to see and play a new game in the Mario and Luigi series as a fan, but it also left me somewhat skeptical. There's some magic in those first few games, and a lot of their identity and charm came from the people who made them. So with Alpha Dream out of the picture, I was worried that a lot of what made Mario and Luigi what it is would be absent from this new game. And while I still have some of that skepticism in me, I'm more than willing to give this game a shot and see if the new studio, Acquire, which developed the Octopath Traveler games, is able to capture a lot of this same magic and really do this series justice. So let's dive into Mario and Luigi Brothership and see where this voyage takes us. And just before we get started here, if you like what I do and want to help out, like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you really want to go above and beyond, you can join my Patreon. You'll see these videos a week in advance, get exclusive updates, and even occasionally get an exclusive video. Alright, plug over. So the game starts out with a cutscene where Luigi, being Luigi, manages to fall off a cliff while running away from a swarm of bees, and just before he falls, Mario saves him. For some reason, their gloves start to glow as this happens, and a huge vortex appears out of nowhere which sucks them, among other things from the Mushroom Kingdom, up into it. Ending up in New York? Wow, that's weird. Unfortunately, while moving through the portal, Luigi dies and Mario is left alone, and he needs to find out where he's been sent. He wakes up on a deserted island, and it's here where we get the majority of the introductions of the basics. Movement, the basics of battle, that sort of thing. Right away, I've got a few thoughts on how Mario moves, specifically the fact that it seems like this game is limited to a 16 direction movement setup, which is kind of strange. Sure, the first 3 games were limited to 8 directions of movement, which made perfect sense since they were controlled by a D-pad, but every other game from Dream Team onwards wasn't limited in this way. They only had enough sprites to represent 16 directions, sure, but they had full 360-degree movement. This is a particularly strange decision because this is the first game in the series that is actually primarily made with full 3D models and environments, so unlike the earlier games, there's pretty much nothing that I can think of that can justify this in any real way. Now this is far from a game-breaking issue, and I got used to it pretty quickly, but on top of full 3D movement looking better and less stilted in 3D environments, it would just feel better to play, so I have no idea why they did it this way. This first island also gives us our first taste as to how Brothership is going to be handling its tutorials, and honestly, for the most part, I think this is probably one of the better implementations of tutorials the series has had. While no tutorials are fully skippable in the traditional sense, the majority of the tutorials here are these quick little pop-up screens that you can easily mash past in a second or two, and can be viewed in a separate tutorial menu if you ever need to see them again. Honestly, outside of tutorials showing up as like a widget on the side of the screen that you'd have to opt in to view, that's pretty much all I can ask for. The information that new people may need is there and viewable if necessary, but people like me who rarely if ever need to engage with it can just shoo it away with very little effort. That being said, Brothership's tutorials are far from perfect, and it does occasionally fall back into that Dream Team style of over-explanation and tutorial imprisonment. For instance, early on there's a tutorial on how the player will navigate the larger world, which is long-winded and can't be skipped. Great. That's unfortunate enough on its own, but that same mechanic is explained again in an entirely different unskippable tutorial just a few hours later.
Stop it. Get some help.
Anyways, Mario explores this uninhabited island, and being guided by the ghost of Luigi, Mario is led to a cliff where he sees another island passing by, as they often do, and jumps towards it, this time being saved by the real Luigi, who apparently didn't actually die. Good for him. On the island, which is shaped like a huge boat, appropriately named Shipshape Island, Mario and Luigi meet Connie and Snoutlet, who is definitely not just a living piggy bank, that give them the rundown as to what's happening. It seems like Mario and Luigi have been transported to an entirely new world, and things aren't going well here. Catastrophe has struck the continent of Concordia, or at least it used to be a continent, as sometime prior to the bros arriving on Shipshape, Concordia was effectively destroyed, being severed into many different small islands and spread across the ocean to wander alone. We aren't given any ideas as to how long the world has been like this, but it's been at least long enough that the people have gotten used to the islands being separate. Connie and Snoutlet have joined forces to try to reconnect the islands and repair Concordia to its former glory, having planted a new tree called a unitree, which is necessary to rebuild the land, and of course are asking Mario and Luigi for help. Obviously, being good hero guys, Mario and Luigi immediately agree to help, and the journey begins. So yeah, the goal here is to take Shipshape Island around the world, find islands that have been sent drifting, and reconnect them to the unitree. Reconnecting the islands is pretty easy. All the bros need to do is reach that island's lighthouse, which they all have, and pull the plug. Once that's done, Snoutlet, who will be joining the bros as their companion for this adventure, will be able to guide that plug into an outlet on Shipshape, linking them up. Once they reconnect enough islands on any one sea, they then need to relight that sea's great lighthouse in order to open a path towards new waters. Now, in order to help Connie reconnect all the islands, Mario and Luigi are going to first have to sail Shipshape Island around the world to find them, and I think that's a really good starting point because Brothership is structured completely differently from any other Mario and Luigi game, and I think for the most part it's a strong foundation that I really love. So, Shipshape is drifting along the ocean, being effectively at the mercy of whatever ocean currents it's able to follow. The player will have to direct the island around, discovering new currents and finding new islands as they go. Now, this is a pretty simple idea, and on the surface it doesn't really give the player a lot of choice in what they're doing and where they're going. You're always going to be limited to the ocean currents, but it establishes something pretty early on that does make things feel a bit more like a true adventure, that you're at least somewhat guiding yourself rather than being fully on rails. In the first sea, after completing and linking up the first island, Rumbla, you immediately get a choice. Shipshape comes across both rainforest and twisty islands, and it's up to you which one you tackle first. In the long run, this doesn't really do all that much. You have to complete both of them either way, but the choice does actually matter. On each of these islands, there's a character that will craft hammers for the bros, and they each specialize in different things. Build It specializes in gloves, whereas Make It specializes in accessories, and whoever you meet first will be the one that joins you on Shipshape, becoming your primary gear maker. Now, obviously this is effectively just a way to let the player know that there isn't one correct path to explore through the islands, and that you can take your time, explore however you like, and tackle things however you want, but actually tying this first choice into the overall experience of battles as well is really clever, and I appreciated that a lot. In my first playthrough I chose Build It, whose gloves are pretty straightforward stat boosts, and in my second I went with Make It, which offered up some more unique accessory effects earlier than they would have been available otherwise. These sorts of choices will pop up from time to time, and typically do offer up some unique gameplay experiences each time. They don't completely change the entire experience, but they do just enough to make the choices feel like they matter. And now that we're sailing around, I kinda want to gush about the experience of exploring the oceans in the game. Now, I'm a sucker for games that give you a boat and let you sail around. I'm one of the biggest apologists for Wind Waker's exploration, and while you're not in direct control of exactly where Shipshape goes, it's a lot more like Spirit Tracks in that regard, it really manages to capture a very similar feeling for me. If you make your way to the edges of the island, you'll get to see how you're moving through the waters. Rocks will pass by on occasion, and if an island is nearby, you'll physically see it move past while you sail. I particularly like the different reefs that you can come across in the seas. These are just different rock formations that have taken various shapes, and Brothership does most of its callbacks to previous games here. You'll see the Shroobs, Brock Monsieur, and the Zkeeper represented here, but most importantly, Prince Peasley. They're fun to see on their own, but when you spot them and report back to this Concordian here, whose name is literally Issa Rock, she sculpts her own versions of these reefs and displays them across Shipshape, which also helps solidify your adventure, as you're getting representations of your exploration on your home base. On that note, Shipshape Island here is going to be acting as our hub for the game, and I think it does a really good job as a central hub. As you'd probably expect, it starts out pretty barren and lonely with just the bros, Connie and Snoutlet around, but it quickly starts to get more lively as you reconnect more islands to the Unitree. You meet important characters on almost every island, and throughout the adventure most of them will take up residence on Shipshape for a while, if not permanently. It becomes a microcosm of all the people you've met and the places you've been to, and that really helps sell the idea that the islands are truly coming back together even if they are still physically separate. And now I feel like this is a good time to go into what this game is all about. We're going to go a little bit more into the weeds about the characters, story, and themes a little later on, but to really understand what Brothership is going for depends on this core idea. Mario & Luigi Brothership is a game about connections. Now, you could pretty easily close that particular circuit by looking at pretty much anything that's happened in the first hour or two of the game. Concordia has broken apart, and it's up to Mario and Luigi to bring them back together. All the main characters in this new world are modeled after some sort of electrical connector, with the majority of Concordians having their designs heavily influenced by power outlets and plugs. North American Type B outlets and plugs specifically, the characters may look a little odd to those who grew up in Europe. Beyond them, there's the Unitree, an obvious play on the word unity, and we use a substance called connector to bridge the gap between the severed islands and the Unitree itself. Now, all of these things are incredibly obvious and are pretty much impossible to miss, but what I appreciate the most out of all of these obvious expressions of the game's theme is that they do an amazing job of burying the lead about how deep these themes will go. Because this is a Mario game and it's making fun electrical puns about plants and connectors, you don't really expect it to have much else deeper to say about those things, but that really couldn't be further from the truth. Some of these connections are pretty simple. For instance, Rumbla Island mainly focuses on the bond between family. Wilma, the chief of the island, was separated from her children Build It and Make It when Concordia broke apart, and their story is largely about the bonds that family have with each other even when they're far apart. It even touches on the ideas of found family as well in regards to Wilma and her sort of adopted child Garumbla. Other islands have different variants of these themes. There's ones that focus on the bonds between friends, islands that focus on the bonds of love, that sort of thing. And of course, while the game focuses on the positives of these bonds, there is a villain who is trying to exploit the opposite as well. Throughout the game, Mario and Luigi will face off against the evil Zocket and his gang of goons, as well as the Extension Corps, who are trying to separate and isolate people using a dark substance known as gloam. We'll get more into what they're up to and what gloam is actually for a little later on. Anyways, once Shipshape has an island in view, Mario and Luigi hop on one of the many little dinghies and safely scoot over to start exploring. Oh, right. No dinghies. Oh well, plan B is to jump in a cannon and get blasted out into the sky and just hope they land in the right spot. Mario, being Mario, is much more confident in this little exercise and knows how to make a proper landing. Luigi, on the other hand, typically doesn't quite hit that landing. These are fun little scenes, and I especially like that throughout the adventure, while Mario's landings don't really change much, Luigi's get better and better, eventually almost being as good as his older brothers. It's a nice touch. We get our first taste of gameplay together with the bros on Rumbla Island, and I'm definitely mixed on a few things here. Obviously, the first thing that any veterans of the series are going to notice is the fact that controlling Luigi is far different here than before, in the sense that you don't really have to do it much. In all previous Mario and Luigi games, both brothers were at least partially individually controlled. Mario typically took the lead and you moved around with Luigi in tow, following directly behind him. But where things got more complicated and more interesting was the fact that all the platforming still had to be done with Luigi. If you tried to jump up a ledge with Mario and didn't jump with Luigi, you just wouldn't go anywhere. But here in Brothership, Luigi is mostly an AI companion. On top of following behind Mario, he'll automatically try to keep up with him when doing platforming and the like as well. The effectiveness of Luigi's AI is mixed to say the least. For the most part, I did find that he ended up doing okay, keeping up with Mario as best as he could, and didn't cause too many problems, but in just the right situations, he'd get stuck or not path towards Mario properly, which would force Mario to stop and wait for Luigi to find his way back to his brother. Now this is really annoying, and I'm sure that many people would say that the solution is to just jump with Luigi manually, since you still can, but that doesn't really work all the time either. Sure, you can, but what ends up happening way more often than you'd expect is what I think is a bug, where instead of following Mario while jumping, he just jumps in place and falls behind, often leading to those same situations where Mario has to stop. I really wish this was fixed because in theory, a Luigi that you could manually control just like the previous games, but who could also take over for those who didn't want to do the more intensive Mario and Luigi platforming, feels like it would be the best of both worlds. A great quality of life improvement for those who dislike the platforming, but the same authentic experience for the fans. However, what we got unfortunately ended up being basically neither. A Luigi that you can't control yourself fully because of that bug, with AI that isn't quite smart enough to properly keep up with Mario all the time. All that said, Luigi becoming an AI companion was done for one very important reason, and is this game's most defining and interesting mechanic: Luigi logic. While you're exploring around, every once in a while Luigi will get ideas in his head, and if you press the L button when he's having these crazy notions of going off and joining a rock band or something, he'll just go and do that. I really like the little animation that pops up in these instances, it's pretty fun. Most of the time Luigi logic is pretty simple. He'll go and pick turnips for Mario, or will break boxes with his hammer or that sort of thing, but the game does quite a few interesting things with it that I really appreciate. For instance, Luigi logic is often used in puzzles. You'll have to get Luigi to stand on seesaw platforms to allow Mario to reach higher areas, use those same platforms to catapult Luigi into low Earth orbit, have Luigi carry things around for Mario, get him to hit switches to allow Mario to traverse platforming puzzles, and even have him do the Wind Waker Forsaken Fortress stealth stuff. I feel like Brothership has some of the strongest puzzle designs in the series because of how they use Luigi logic. They're constantly doing new things with it and are constantly expanding on previous ideas throughout the adventure. They really do get a ton of mileage out of this mechanic, and we haven't even gotten to the important stuff yet. When it comes to the core platforming mechanics, Brothership is definitely a little scaled back from the last few games, but I feel like that does work pretty well here. There are fewer moves that the bros can do, but the game utilizes them really well, all things considered. The first move that the bros learn via a burst of Luigi logic is the UFO spin. This is pretty much the same spin jump that they've used for basically every other game in the series, and it works very similarly. Mario and Luigi will take their tango stance and spin themselves around so fast that they start to fly, allowing them to traverse gaps that are much larger than they'd normally be able to through jumping. This later gets upgraded, letting the bros abduct some objects to create new paths, or to block dangerous lava that would burn them to a crisp otherwise. This is probably not my favorite version of the spin jump. I actually think Dream Team's Luiginary spin is the best of the bunch, but hey, it does its job pretty well, and I had fun using it. The second ability is the Bro Ball, which is right out of Partners in Time, letting the bros fit into gaps and tubes that they'd otherwise be unable to. The upgrade to this one is basically just the spin dash, giving the bros a speed boost whenever it's needed. I kinda wish this was a little more useful, and the full 360-degree movement would have done a ton to help out in this regard. While it's cool that the ball gets this speed boost, and if you're just going in one direction, it can be pretty useful to get from A to B a little bit quicker, but none of that momentum is really carried over when you need to change directions. If the game had full 360-degree movement and you could actually control the bro ball while at at full speed, it'd probably be my go-to bro move to get from place to place, but unfortunately, as it is, it's just a little too unintuitive to actually use all that frequently. The third ability is actually the first one that isn't unlocked via a Luigi Brain Blast. Eventually, the bros come across these statues that bestow the powers of fire and ice upon them, which are literally just fire and ice flowers. I think it's really cool that we got elemental powers back, but it's such a shame that Luigi's thunder powers are stuck in Superstar Saga. I think those abilities fit him really well. Oh well, what we got here are pretty fun, all things considered. Mario gets to shoot fire and Luigi shoots ice, which is mostly used for puzzle solving in ice and lava areas. Mario can melt ice and Luigi can freeze lava, you know how all these things work. What is pretty interesting about these flowers is the fact that they are the only abilities that have any use in battles. You can shoot fire or ice at enemies and that will count as a preemptive strike on an enemy, giving them the respective status effects. Now again, thanks to the restricted movement, this didn't end up being super useful, and you're much more likely to just get hit trying to land a shot, but it's a cool inclusion at least. The power up to this ability combines the bros flowers together to create a bro bomb, which is used to destroy obstacles that are too big and strong for anything else they have. Now what's particularly interesting is how you activate all of these abilities. The Mario and Luigi games have had a pretty unique ability selection tradition going all the way back to Superstar Saga, where all of your abilities were activated on the same two buttons for the bros and were swapped around using the L and R buttons. While it made perfect sense there, considering how limited that system's control layout was, it's made less and less sense ever since that point, especially in Dream Team, but Brothership has taken a brave step forward and has completely ditched that old system for something that's far better, at least for the most part. So yeah, instead of having everything being on A and B while just walking around and exploring, those two buttons are exclusively mapped to jump, and their hammers are mapped to X and Y. This is very similar to what I suggested in my Dream Team video. Curious. Now, I'm not saying that I'm responsible for this, as the game was probably almost done even before I started working on that video, but what I am saying is that I'm expecting a check in the mail. But since L sends Luigi off to do whatever he fancies and R now opens up a new menu, they clearly had to find a new way to change these abilities, and I think the solution is good, if a little clunky. Switching from the standard formation to any of these abilities happens on the right stick. Right for the UFO spin, down for the bro ball, and left for the flowers. This is a really good setup, and I do think that it works really well, but I wish the game was a little more lenient when it comes to letting the bros take these forms. If Luigi isn't in the exact right spot, or if Mario sees his shadow or something, they just won't be able to change. Again, this is the sort of issue that adds an extra second of time wasted every few minutes at most, but it just makes the experience feel a little more rough than it could have been, and a little bit of extra polish could have worked wonders. Now, these abilities are cool and all, but it doesn't really matter if the levels you're moving through aren't fun on their own. Thankfully, the many islands in Concordia's seas are typically pretty fun and do a good job of keeping things fresh. Geez, they're multiplying. I really do like the variety in the islands that Concordia is made out of. The island themes themselves aren't necessarily all mind-blowingly original. There's the jungle island, where the bros will need to move vines around to progress. There's the desert island that involves navigating quicksand, and the flower island that has bouncy flowers for some fun platforming, that sort of thing. It's pretty standard Mario fare for the most part, and while I do wish there were some more islands that were a little more unique to get more of that globe-trotting Mario Odyssey feel, I do think that these more standard areas do their jobs pretty well. What makes exploring each island more engaging and fun is the fact that each one does have its own ideas, gimmicks, and mechanics that help them stand out. For instance, Floral Island. Like I just said, its main platforming mechanic involves the bouncy flowers, but that isn't the only thing it's got going for it. This island also introduces the UFO spin, so it has a lot of platforming centered around that, and it's got a fun little Luigi logic minigame that's straight out of Bowser's Arms from Inside Story. Now, it is strictly worse than the version from that game since there's no unique music to go along with it, making the rhythm game a lot less musical, but it's still decently fun whenever it pops up. One island that I really love in theory is Bulbfish Island. This is one of the most unique island setups we've come across, where Mario and Luigi find themselves in the midst of a mystery. The island's famous bulbfish eggs have disappeared, and nobody really knows what happened. Tensions are particularly high because on top of the bros showing up, another set of foreigners have recently found their way to the island. Chilliam and Bernadette here are a couple that have traveled to the island to get away from from their unapproving families and have found themselves as the primary suspects. Not because they're inherently suspicious or anything, but because the island's leaders are looking for a quick scapegoat to cover up their own inability to solve the crime. What makes things worse here is the fact that many islanders are being overcome by gloam, which is a substance that Zocket has been weaponizing to make people viciously distrustful and antisocial. So the bros have to come to the rescue and investigate the disappearance of the eggs. This involves talking to residents, finding clues, and uncovering a secret that the people leading the island don't want to come out. That seems pretty cool, right? Well, it is, but unfortunately this island is also a hallmark for what I would consider Brothership's biggest issue: the pacing. Bulbfish Island is really padded, and that kinda sucks. To give a quick rundown, first the bros need to ask around to decide whether or not they think Chilliam and Bernadette are the real culprits, which of course they're not. They then need to gain access to the town's prison, which involves convincing the guard that they are virtuous. After exploring the dungeon, they find a note heavily implying the mayor's assistant is behind everything. So obviously all that's left to do is confront him with this evidence, right? Nope. After this point, the whole sequence basically repeats and you have to go through most of the same motions to actually solve the mystery. Pacing issues like this pop up a few times throughout the game. There's forced island revisits, individual side stories spread out across multiple islands for no reason, a big endgame MacGuffin hunt, and more. I wouldn't say that any of these things are inherently bad, but Brothership does them in a way that often does feel like padding. Like, about halfway through the game, Shipshape Island gets attacked and a few islands are disconnected. So we have to go back to those islands and reach the lighthouses again to reconnect them. It's not exactly the same, but there really isn't anything to justify these revisits. Early game sailing could also end up as a pretty big sticking point for some people. When you're sailing Shipshape around in this first sea, you're going pretty slow, and if for some reason you end up missing your opportunity to launch to a new island, you may just be stuck there for several minutes waiting for that opportunity to come back. This does get remedied a little later on with the ability to sail significantly faster and even an instant warp in the endgame, but that early sluggishness does end up making an impact on the experience. Now, they did try to patch up the situation a little bit with how they set up their side quests, but to be honest, I'm not sure that it does that good a job at being that band-aid. So once an island is complete, typically new areas will open up on it and a handful of side quests will pop up, with more showing up as you progress through the game. What Brothership typically expects out of you is that while you're sailing around waiting for that next new island to show up, is that you should go do side quests. On paper that does make sense. You're effectively given mandatory downtime in between islands, so they fill that time with things you can do, flesh out previous areas more, and even occasionally more deeply explore some of the characters you've met throughout the journey. The thing is, the quality of the side quests is typically not super high, especially for the regular ones that pop up on other islands. Like, one of the side quests on Rumbla that shows up once you get the hammers is literally just to go to a guy and press the hammer button a bunch of times. Like, why? Thankfully, there are a subset of side quests that are pretty great, and they're mostly ones that are tied directly to the main cast. For instance, one of the characters you meet early on, Ark, has lost his spyglass and the bros get a quest to go and find it. It's far from a complex, exciting side quest, but after the fact, we learn quite a bit more about Ark, what happened to him and his father, and how he got roped into this whole situation. This is pretty good, and most of the main cast gets at least one of these that goes into their pasts, struggles, and bonds. These are quests that you'll definitely want to do as soon as they pop up, not only for the narrative aspects, but because they're typically time limited. The game will remind you of this a few times throughout the game, and while some may consider this to be an example of over-tutorializing, I'm actually kind of fine with it. It doesn't happen often, and these are what I would consider to be critical content, so reminding people to do them is something that I can forgive. There are a few other side things you can do as well, specifically the little islets that pop up from time to time. They're just little islands that typically have smaller, more condensed challenges that focus on one thing at a time, or have their own little minigames. I like that these were included, especially the ones that have minigames on them. I always love when the Mario and Luigi games lean into minigames, and Brothership definitely doesn't disappoint in this regard. Now, I have complained about quite a few things so far, but I want to stress that while I do have issues with the game's world and exploration, they really are minor issues. The islands you explore are usually really fun, even with the few clunkers, and I just love sailing around Concordia. Pacing is by far the game's biggest issue, and on that note, I think we should probably start talking about the pacing's second casualty, the battle system. So if you're familiar with the Mario and Luigi series up to this point, the battles should immediately feel familiar. Mario and Luigi take part in turn-based RPG battles where they'll have to attack enemies with jumps, hammers, or bros attacks, and dodge or counter incoming attacks from those enemies. Equipment works pretty much the same as the later games, and even the rank bonuses feel right out of Paper Jam. It feels right at home with pretty much every game in the series from Bowser's Inside Story onward, so if you liked what those games do, then you're very likely to love what Brothership does too. The first interesting thing I want to point out though are Mario and Luigi's basic attacks, as this is the first time since Partners in Time that they've seen a significant rework. For instance, when you select A to jump on an enemy, which you have to do with Luigi now too, and that is very disorienting after playing all the other games, you don't just do the standard 2-press double jump. Now, instead of each brother attacking individually, both bros take part in every attack, at least as long as they're both alive. I really love this. Now, battle speed is something I've criticized the later Mario and Luigi games for, and with these new animations and such, each turn using regular attacks is a similar speed to Dream Team's real-world battle system, which I found to be particularly sluggish compared to Bowser's Inside Stories. However, I think the fact that each attack requires more inputs and therefore requires more attention pretty much eliminates this issue for me. In fact, these regular attacks remind me a lot of the bros attacks from Superstar Saga. Requiring 3 or more inputs seemed like a lot back then when a regular attack was only 1, but it kinda just feels normal now, and I think this was a great way to grow the regular battle system while not changing its identity that much. Another thing I love about this battle system is its unique mechanical twist, battle plugs. Much like every game since Bowser's Inside Story, this mechanic feels like it's a natural evolution from the one that came before it. Bowser's Inside Story introduced badges, which worked as a customizable limit break of sorts. Dream Team expanded on that idea and let you store multiple charges for whenever you wanted, and Paper Jam turned those into effect cards that you could draw and play as long as you had enough land. Brothership kinda just asks, hey, what if you could just have like 5 effects at once and use them all for free? And yeah, that's kinda what happens with the battle plugs. Now, it doesn't start out that crazy. Early on you only get like 2 slots, so that doesn't really allow for a lot of insane builds, but once you get to the end and have all of the slots unlocked, you can start to do some really fun things. Of course, there are limits. You don't just get free boosts forever. Each plug has a set amount of charges, which once they're used up will go into a recharge. The recharge mechanic is really important for this system since it effectively forces you to try different plugs out from time to time. No battle plug is bad per se, they're all beneficial in some way, so just leaving the slots empty is a bit of a waste. Also, the best plugs are like super broken, so if anybody had a choice, they'd just keep the best ones on at all times. Typically though, the best plugs have by far the longest recharge times, going up to like 40 turns to recharge, so you won't be able to purely rely on those best of the best plugs. That's a good thing in my opinion, since this is a really deep and fun system once you start to use it, and I particularly love how the effects the devs have come up with this time around are much more unique and fun than the previous game's iterations. For instance, 2 of the plugs you get early on are the Kaboom Attack plug and the Iron Ball plug. These power up your regular attacks, with the Kaboom Attack giving each one a small AoE blast and the Iron Ball plug adding extra hits after you attack. Later plugs really ramp up the power of each plug, doing things like having bros automatically use whichever healing item you want, be that mushrooms, syrup, or even 1-up shrooms, which is incredibly powerful, especially on particularly difficult bosses. On the other hand, there's also things like the Bros Boost to power up bros attacks, with the trade-off of increased BP use and bros efficiency, which restores half of the BP used in any bros attack. Obviously, these are very good together, but it's also not quite as simple as that either. There's a plug combo system that lets certain plugs combine to create even stronger attacks than they'd normally be able to. The Kaboom Attack and Iron Ball are the perfect example of this. On their own, they're fine, but honestly not that game-changing. But if you use them both at the same time, the effects combine, so not only do your attacks have AoE blasts, but all enemies hit by that blast will also take damage from the Iron Balls. If you use 2 of each, the AoE blast gets large enough to hit all enemies, and even more Iron Balls end up falling on them all, doing damage that often equals or even occasionally outpaces bros attacks. It really reminds me of Batten Kaido's Origins EX combo system, and that's a great thing. Now obviously there aren't nearly as many plug combos, but finding and performing these combos gives a similar feeling of discovery when you first see them, and I love that. Thankfully, most of the battle plugs aren't really missable either. Almost all of them are made in the menu by feeding Snoutlet Lumen lemonade, which you gather by plucking sprite bulbs out of the ground while exploring. This was one of the things that kept me going back to explore the islands even once I was finished with their stories. I really wanted to be able to have as many options as I could, and finding the sprite bulbs was the only way to do that. So yeah, I think this is probably my favorite of these badge adjacent mechanics from any of the Mario and Luigi games, and it does a huge amount to elevate the system as a whole to nearly my favorite of the bunch. There is an argument to be made that even with the cooldown timers, some of these plugs facilitate too much power in the player's favor and can pretty much nuke certain bosses from orbit with them. To that I say, yeah, kinda, but honestly I don't think it's really a big issue in my eyes. Outside of like 2 instances, the main source of difficulty in this series isn't from the bosses having huge HP pools, it's their attacks being strong and difficult to avoid, so I don't really mind. Moving on to the topic of Bros attacks, I overall think they were done decently well here, creating a couple of fun new moves and bringing back some of my old favorites like the jump helmet, but I do have one major bone to pick. One of the things that historically balanced out the strength of the Bros moves was the fact that they were often pretty difficult to pull off. Magic Window was an incredibly powerful attack that could melt enemies away if you did it right, but it was so hard to do that you'd very rarely get the most out of it. That's something that for the most part will never happen in Brothership. Now there are a few attacks that require memorization, like the Yoo-Hoo Cannon, which can easily be failed if you aren't paying attention, but most of them are purely execution based, and man, the inputs for these are often distractingly lenient. I would press a button and immediately despair at the fact that I knew I pressed it way too early to have it register, and then it would just work. I honestly really don't like this. Mastering Bros moves used to take a ton of practice, and I loved learning how they worked and landing those excellent blows, but that learning curve is mostly gone here. They're all so easy that even if you don't really know what you're doing, you're pretty likely to be able to land excellence on almost any enemy you come across, and that's kinda disappointing, since it does take away some of the fun that you can get from learning these moves. Speaking of enemies, that's another thing I have a bit of an issue with. The enemy variety, while not bad, seems like it's a tad mismatched with the game. Like, Concordia is a big set of islands filled with electrical socket people, electrical bugs, electrical fish, that sort of thing, so you'd expect that the enemies would at least attempt to fit into that theme, right? Well, outside of Zocket's army, none of the game's bestiary relates to Concordia's aesthetic pretty much at all. There's seed guys, chameleon guys, totem pole guys, that kind of thing. They're mostly just kinda generic. There are some interesting enemy designs, they just happen to come from other games in the Mario and Luigi series. Capnaps from Dream Team are here, as well as Shark Bones from Superstar Saga. Crows are a little more interesting as they aren't just a pure copy, but they are effectively just metallic versions of the Treevils from Bowser's Inside Story. That's not to say that the enemies here are bad by any means, they aren't, and I feel like Brothership's enemies actually managed to do one thing better than any other game in the series. One of the struggles of creating a Mario and Luigi enemy is how the attacks are going to affect both brothers. Early games didn't really do much with that, so there was very little reason to ever dodge individually with either one. Doing so together was pretty much always the best choice. Later games improved on this a ton, but I think Brothership basically does it the best. There are tons of enemies that sweep through the bros, or stagger attacks between them, or attack from different angles every time, and it really keeps you on your toes. There's one enemy in the late game that actually kinda blew my mind. It's a big flower enemy that grows 5 buds around the bros in different orders and at different elevations. You need to memorize the order they grow because they'll send out energy bursts in that order, and if you don't know which one is going to burst when, both bros can easily get wiped by it. This is honestly such a genius attack, and I hope if we were to get more games in the future in the series, more enemies would be built around this sort of idea. And the bosses are arguably even better in this regard. So many of them, especially the late game bosses, have crazy attacks that are incredibly challenging and super fun to get right. Just in general, the bosses are great. All the major bosses that you find in the game's main dungeons are really unique, really fun, and while most of them aren't particularly difficult overall, thanks to the battle plugs being amazing, I greatly enjoyed them. One of the things I loved the most was how they incorporated Luigi logic into them. Pretty much all main bosses will have a special gimmick that uses Luigi logic. Luigi will notice something that he can mess with, and if you succeed, the boss will typically end up stunned for a turn or two, letting you wail on them indiscriminately. A couple later bosses even have small mini-games tied to Luigi logic prompts, and they were a ton of fun to pull off. If nothing else, the Luigi logic bits were a great little change of pace for battles, which was something that was really needed because unlike every game since Bowser's Inside Story, Brothership doesn't actually have a secondary battle system. And honestly, while I didn't adore the giant battles in Dream Team and basically hated the papercraft fights from Paper Jam, I do appreciate the novelty they brought to the table. And considering the pacing issues Brothership has, I feel like this is the one game that actually could have used something like it. Like, imagine using Shipshape Island to take part in nautical battles like in Assassin's Creed Black Flag or Skies of Arcadia. There are several moments in the story that would facilitate that, and man, it would just be so cool. But I guess I've just complained so much about these secondary battle systems in these games that I'm just reaping what I'm sowing here. Oh well. And yeah, the pacing does end up hurting the experience of battles a ton, honestly. This is one of my favorite battle systems in the series, but it takes like 20 plus hours for it to get to that point. You don't get battle plugs at all until like 5 hours in, which is well beyond the halfway point of Superstar Saga, and you're limited to the first 2 bros attacks for even longer than that. If it had front-loaded more stuff, it would have been so much better, but you really just have to push through these opening hours at times. Anyways, despite my many small gripes with the battle system here, like enemy variety not being super numerous, bros moves being too lenient to execute, some of the battle plugs being too powerful, and of course how long it takes to fully flesh itself out, overall this is still one of my favorite battle systems in the entire series. The game is still way too new to say whether or not it's actually my favorite, that will have to simmer for a while, but the only other games in the series I'd had as much fun with in battles are Superstar Saga and Bowser's Inside Story, which are in my opinion the absolute best the series has to offer in this regard. It really does do a ton to elevate the game as a whole, and I was more than willing to do a second playthrough immediately after my first, because I was just having so much fun with the battles, warts and all. With all that out of the way, let's start talking about a couple of the things that are a little more controversial about this game, like the fact that the visuals are all in full 3D now, and that Yoko Shimomura isn't returning to do the music. 2 things that I'm sure are going over very well with the fan base. Yeah, let's get right into the music to start here. So, as I just said, Yoko Shimomura, the composer for every other game in the series, did not return to do the music in Brothership. I'm still not really sure how I feel about this. Shimomura's music is absolutely iconic, and it was the series' clearest tie to its roots with Super Mario RPG. Her style is incredibly distinct, and how she was able to weave it into a Mario context was incredibly important to the identity of the series. With her not returning, the composing duties were given to Hideki Sakamoto, and yeah, the shoes he had to fill were unrealistically enormous. The music he wrote for the game fits it very well, is varied, and captures loads of different atmospheres, but the timbre is very different from anything Shimomura would write. Melodies are written a lot more around brass instruments, which is pretty typical for Mario as a whole, but Shimomura was a lot more drawn to piano and strings, which gave the music of previous games a unique feel in the Mario franchise. Either way, the music here is pretty good, with area themes like Twisty Island, and All Sand Island, clear standouts to me. On the other hand, I do feel like the battle themes are the overall weakest in the series. The second boss battle theme is alright. And I think the final boss's theme is pretty great. But I don't know, the other battle themes just didn't really do much for me. Next, let's talk about the visual presentation here, because frankly, I am completely charmed. There was reason to be skeptical about the Mario and Luigi franchise's transition into full 3D, because boy, any 3D stuff in the series prior to this that wasn't Dream Team's giant battles were not very good. And the only reason Dream Team stands up at all is because it wasn't Alpha Dream that made them. But I wasn't against the idea of going full 3D either. I adore what Alpha Dream was able to do with the sprite art, but yeah, making a lot of very good looking sprite art is very expensive and a very time consuming process, so a transition to 3D was inevitable. The only thing that I was really worried about was whether or not it was going to be able to do those sprites justice. Brothership accomplishes this in spades in my opinion. Just look at Mario and Luigi's character models. While they obviously aren't the highest polygon count models we've ever seen of the bros, they do look really good, and check out the coloring here. This is shading straight out of the box art from previous games. Just from that you can tell that the people doing the art here care for and respect what came before it, and this continues into the animations. One of the things I loved the most about the majority of the Mario and Luigi games was how bouncy the sprite animations were. They gave the game so much energy and life, and really helped make the act of just looking at the games a joy. Brothership captures that really well. Models will stretch and smear to emulate the 2D art, and the animations are really exaggerated to help sell the cartoony look that the series was known for. It's really great. I also really love the character designs here. I'm always going to advocate for more new species and races in the Mario franchise, since this series is so versatile and able to fit so many different things within itself so easily, and the Concordian people are an excellent addition. It's such an obvious thing too, like of course power outlets look like faces, with the two main pins being eyes and the ground being the mouth. I especially like how they worked other aspects of plugs into their designs too. For instance, Connie, who is the cutest thing ever and must be protected at all costs, wears a hat that is straight up just a plug and is topped with cut wires. It's just perfect. Most of the other main characters we meet have unique design quirks like that too, but if I were to criticize one thing about the Concordians, it's that the generic NPCs aren't particularly well differentiated. There's the small one, the tall one, and the fat one, of course having different hairstyles and such. This is a very small gripe, and honestly one that's probably inevitable considering the starting point is this, and they are still infinitely more unique than Toads, but I feel like they could have done a little bit more with these characters. Environments are also pretty good, with each island looking unique and interesting, and nothing being particularly ugly, but there is one thing I do need to bring up: the frame rate. So I'm an advocate for higher frame rates in games being typically better, but as long as the game is stable and not too choppy, I can forgive slightly lower frame rates, especially in games that don't necessarily require them. This is one of those games, but boy does Brothership end up struggling at times. Now to be completely clear, the majority of the game is fine. Most of the time you spend exploring islands or battling, there are basically no issues at all, but Shipshape is another thing altogether. Later on in the game, once Shipshape becomes more and more populated, the game just can't deal with the amount of things it has to render, and the frame rate gets absolutely hammered. It's even worse if you try to use the faster sailing too. I've seen frame rates drop to sub 10 at times, which is frankly unacceptable. Now I don't want to say that it should have just been delayed and ported to Switch 2 instead, because that really doesn't help anything and isn't much of a valid option, but man, the Switch is old, and it's showing its age more and more with every new game released for it. We really are at the point where new games are suffering because of the platform it's released on, and that's a shame because aside from these few issues, Brothership does look great and it deserves better. Now there is one more thing that I do have an issue with: the menus. They're just so boring to look at. Now I'm not saying that the game needs to be Metaphor Fantasio or anything, but in any game where going through menus is going to be a frequent thing, they need to at the very least have a little bit of flair. What we've got here is clean and readable, but they feel so soulless, which really puts them at odds with the rest of the game in my opinion. Alright, so we're going to start talking about the characters, story, and writing now, because it's quite a bit different from anything we've seen in the Mario and Luigi series so far, and I think the character that exemplifies this the most is actually the game's main antagonist, Zocket. I think Zocket is a really interesting villain, not because he has a whole lot of depth or deep-seated issues that caused him to go down a villainous path or anything, but because of how well he works in with the game's theme of connection. Zocket's plan here is not exactly known right off the bat, but what we do know is that he's working towards a world where everyone is isolated, and you can probably imagine that he had something to do with Concordia's destruction based off that alone. I haven't been participating in much of the discourse around the game, but one thing I have seen is that Zocket is being criticized because he only has one joke and isn't very funny. I do understand the urge to see comedy in a Mario & Luigi game. Superstar Saga was literally built entirely around comedy, but I think that misses the mark here. What some people see as a joke is the fact that he never remembers the names of anyone, be that Mario or Luigi, Bowser, or even his minions, X10 and Shun. Yeah, you could read that as a joke, in which case, yeah, it isn't very funny and gets old really quickly, but I think that's a particularly uncharitable reading of Zocket. Zocket is a villain that the story takes completely seriously all the time. The fact that he doesn't remember people's names is because, to him, no one matters. His goal is to create a world where everyone is alone, where people's connections are all severed, and the most basic connection you can make with someone is knowing their name. Thus, he sees the act of knowing a person's name as irrelevant. This even comes across in his design. His tie is actually a pair of shears, which obviously represents his desire to cut people off from one another. Obviously, there is a bit more to Zocket, as we'll get into during the plot section, but I really like him and think he works well as the game's main antagonist. That isn't to say that there isn't comedy to be found here, there absolutely is, and while a big part of this game is built around purposefully awful humor, Brothership does still have its fair share of genuinely funny stuff. The Extension Corps do a great job of being the more comedic side to the villain group. Each one has a fun personality and they all have some standout comedic moments. In fact, they brought me the biggest laugh I've ever had from this series, so that's an accomplishment if I've ever seen one. And one more thing I love about the game's writing is how much more genuine and heartfelt the whole experience feels in comparison to the previous games. While the writing in the previous games is pretty much all great, there was a constant sense of farce to it. Like, no matter the stakes, that comedic core still had to shine through, so they were a little more difficult to take seriously. Partners in Time definitely notwithstanding. That's not to downplay the previous stories at all, they just had slightly different priorities. But Brothership really focuses in on its characters, their struggles, and their relationships in a way that no other game has, which really helped me relate to them a lot more, and honestly, this is one of the things that really helped me push through some of the more sluggish sections. Connie is obviously the one the game focuses on the most, and for good reason. Her arc here is really strong, since at the start of the game, she's mostly alone, and has been given a task that feels insurmountable. She's a junior Wattonist, not even fully qualified for the job, and she has the entire world put on her shoulders, and more than anything, she just wishes that her teacher Cosette would be here to help her. As her mentor, Cosette was Connie's rock, not only teaching her about the role of a Wattonist, but life in general. After Cosette disappeared, Connie felt lost and didn't know how she'd be able to restore Concordia. Throughout the game, she starts to become more confident in herself and realizes that she needs to be strong to reforge the bonds of Concordia and save the one that was always there to save her. She really is a great character, and the game would be significantly less engaging without her. And while I don't really have that much to say about Snoutlet, I do like him as well. He's a good companion character that is just fun enough to be likable without going too far into the annoying realm. Okay, so there's a few more things we need to go over here, so as per usual, there's going to be a timestamp somewhere on the screen if you don't want the ending to be spoiled for you and you want to skip it. Anyways, let's get going. So the story here is a very slow burn, and we really don't even get much of a hint as to what exactly is going on until Gloam starts showing up more frequently in the third sea. But until that point, Mario and Luigi spend most of their time relinking islands and relighting great lighthouses. Throughout the journey, we meet a ton of new and old faces, and one that I didn't really expect to see was Princess Peach. I mean, yeah, I probably should have expected it. It is a Mario game, so Peach is pretty likely to show up, but this was the first sign that it wasn't just the bros that got sucked up into the vortex, and that we'd likely see more familiar faces as we go. And yeah, we definitely do, because Starlo is here too. Great. Honestly, this is the most tolerable version of Starlo we've had since her introduction, and she is very minor, faffing about with Peach for the majority of the game, so I'm fine with her inclusion. We do get some interesting Starlo lore here. She implies that the form she takes on land here isn't what she truly looks like, and that there's some sort of Lovecraftian, biblically accurate Starlo to be seen at some point in the future. Bring it on, Nintendo. A lot of things happen really quickly once we reach the third sea. We've met a ton of people up to this point, forged many new connections, dimensions, and one of the biggest events that happens here is we get to celebrate the bond that Chilliam and Bernadette have by having their wedding. This is a great little scene that really just shows how far everyone has come and how many new friends Connie and the bros have made throughout the adventure. But that celebration doesn't last long, as soon after the wedding, Shipshape Island is caught up in the crossfire of a battle between Zocket's fortress, which our mechanic friend Techniki dubs Fortress Zocket because she's a genius, and Bowser's army, which apparently all got sent here too. Interestingly, while the game is focused on bonds and connections, it doesn't really explore the bond between Bowser and Junior much here, despite them being prime candidates for it. Bowser's love for his son is shown, but Junior's story is more focused around him making a new friend in Concordia. I do think this is the better direction though, because it's a good extension of the story in Bowser Jr.'s journey from the Bowser's Inside Story remake. Junior struggled with the idea of valuing people around him in that game. His selfishness frequently pushed others away, and him making a new, genuine friend here in Concordia shows a lot of growth, even if many of his old tendencies do come out to sabotage that friendship at times. Anyways, at this point in the story, the effects of the gloam are getting too serious to ignore, and the bros need to find a cure, which is a fruit called an amp berry that only grows on an island separate from any currents. They do make their way to the island, which Bowser has built a new castle on, and after infiltrating it, they do find the amp berries, which they take to cure anyone that is infected with the gloam. After relighting the fourth and final Great Lighthouse, the path to Fortress Socket is clear, and it's time for the bros to take him down once and for all. Bowser shows up there as well because the Extension Corps had kidnapped Junior, and Zocket takes the opportunity to show the bros the power of gloam by infecting Bowser with a highly concentrated dose of it. Gloam Bowser is one of my favorite bosses in the game. He hits hard, his attacks are quick, and his design is really good in a very subtle way. Like, it's just Bowser, but with a bit of a red aura and jet boots. Yet he carries himself differently because the gloam has erased the somewhat cordial bond that he has with the bros, leaving only his rage. After defeating him, the bros have to flee Fortress Socket since the gloam power he wields is just too strong at this time. They find themselves on the island that Mario woke up on at the start of the game, and we get a few revelations here. First is that Mario and Luigi being brought to Concordia wasn't an accident. The Great Conductor, who lives on this island, felt the bond of love between the brothers from beyond the dimensions and knew that they would be the ones who would be best able to help save Concordia, so he brought them here and had Snoutlet act as their guide. Second is regarding the identity of Zocket. Now, I personally thought that this was the most obvious twist that has ever been written in history, but it's revealed that Zocket is actually Connie's missing mentor, Cosette, who has been possessed by some force and brainwashed into being Zocket. I don't know how they could have hid this better, but yeah, it was way too obvious to be treated like some big reveal, you know? Oh, and I also want to take a quick tangent to talk about Luigi here as well. One of the things that the Great Conductor specifically brings up is the fact that Luigi was integral in the success of the adventure, his bursts of inspiration and out-of-the-box thinking being so important to getting past obstacles, and that Concordia itself resonates with Luigi's creativity, giving birth to Luigi logic. Luigi has pretty much always been a second fiddle in the series and in the Mario franchise as a whole, even in Dream Team where Mario is still in charge during Luigi's dreams. Letting Luigi be the one who's driving progress throughout the game is great, letting his personality shine through in a tangible way that isn't related to him being scared or being the butt of a joke. I kinda think that this game treats Luigi as a character better than even the ones that were dedicated to him during the year of Luigi, and I appreciate that. Luigi has always been the more interesting of the two brothers, but he rarely gets a chance to properly shine in a way that isn't directly tied to Mario, so I love that Brothership was able to do that for him. Anyways, with the Great Conductor's power and blessing, Mario and Luigi are now ready to take on Zocket again. At least they would be if Shipshape could get there, but Zocket created a large thorn wall surrounding the fortress, and the bros need to figure out how to get past it. Now, we get another choice here, and I think that this is the only choice in the game that actually has a correct option. We need to build something onto Shipshape that can get around the barrier, and there's two options here. Our pal Techniki can build an engine to fly over the barrier, which will let all the people we know on board help out. Daphne, Techniki's rival, has a different idea. She can build a bubble of sorts to let Shipshape sink beneath the waves to get to the fortress, the caveat being that she won't let any of Mario's friends help out. Her own employees will do all of the work. Yeah, the Techniki engine is the correct option here. The whole game is about valuing the connections we have with people. Mario telling all of his friends to go kick rocks because he wants a submarine just isn't right. Although a submarine boat would be pretty cool, we might even be able to sail under the red line with it. This second run through Fortress Zocket is pretty fun. Mario and Luigi get separated by the Extension Corps, and we have to play a bunch of this dungeon solo, swapping between the bros to solve puzzles. puzzles. This is something from the early games that I adored, but we didn't really get much of beyond Partners in Time. Once they are reunited, we get the final standoff between the bros and the Extension Corps, and this is a fun fight, but it's a lot more fun if you don't steamroll through it, since there's a few cool things they do and they have some fun dialogue, but if you beat them too quickly, you just won't see it. Once they're down, all that's left to do is take down Zocket once and for all. His fight is awesome. He has some of the best attacks in the game and is really tough. Once he goes down, the Zocket persona fades, revealing Cosette, but it's too late. The egg that Zocket had been incubating hatches, and the game's true villain is finally revealed. The being that hatches from the egg is known as Reclusa, and he is very unsubtle. As soon as he hatches, he starts ranting about how much he hates togetherness and is going to build a world with perfect solitude. And you know what? I appreciate it. Reclusa isn't meant to be this sympathetic villain. He's the narrative's antithesis and does that job really well. As soon as Mario and Luigi escape the fortress with Cosette in tow, Reclusa starts making his mark on the world in a really interesting way. He starts spreading his isolation around by having these strange plants grow out of the ground and grab people. What's particularly interesting about this is that these plants kind of work like a very immersive VR experience, where whichever person is grabbed experiences what they consider to be a perfect world. Everyone they care about is with them and there are no problems, a true state of bliss. But of course, this is all fake. The world around them is falling apart, and if they were stuck in the plants long enough, they would slowly deteriorate until they eventually die. I think this is the game's strongest statement, what I consider to be a critique of the modern social media landscape, if you couldn't tell from the VR headset brainsuckers and Reclusa's face being a screen. What Reclusa offers people are worlds where they feel like they're connected at all times, surrounded by everything that they want to see, while in reality being completely alienated from everyone they care about, absorbed in fake lives that don't have any substance to them. Now, obviously, real social media is a much more complicated situation. There are real connections to be made there, and it is nowhere near constant bliss. But it does have a similar grip on people. You can get so lost in the algorithmic feed that you stop being able to care about anything else. But yeah, what Reclusa wants is for everyone to be sucked into their own little worlds, ignorant to the state of everything around them, so that once everything crumbles away, the world will be one of true solitude, a universe with no one in it. Damn. Of course, Mario and Luigi aren't going to let that happen, so they need to find a way to reach Reclusa and take him down once and for all. It's going to be much harder this time, since Reclusa has grown his own floral fortress to keep everyone else out, which he actually cleverly names as the Solitree. Cosette, who has come back to her senses, gives us a clue as to what we need to do. The only thing that can break through the Solitree's defenses are strong bonds, and conveniently enough, Connie's bonding can is capable of storing the power of bonds within it. So yeah, we get an endgame MacGuffin hunt. Once we do a quick run through of places we've been before to gather these bonds, which takes like an hour, we finally get into the Solitree to finish this. I think this is a fantastic final dungeon, all things considered. It's an excellent test of basically every main mechanic we've had to use so far. It has some fantastic puzzles and some very tough enemies. But I think the best section happens after we reach the second floor. Mario and Luigi decide to leave Connie to tend to Cosette, who came into the Solitree on her own, and just as we do that, something very strange happens. The screen goes black, and the next thing the bros know, they're back in the Mushroom Kingdom. Now what's happened here is pretty obvious. The bros have been snatched up by Reclusa's flowers and are being fed a fake Mushroom Kingdom to make them think that everything is over and that the day has been saved. This is such a creepy section, dude. I love it. It starts out eerie enough on its own, but as you play through the loop more and more and start to realize Reclusa's part in this simulation, it goes even further into that eeriness. Question mark blocks stop working properly, the game starts using Dutch angles for the cutscenes, and everything starts glitching out. Eventually, after chasing down Reclusa within the simulation long enough, he gets tired of the bros resisting and lets them out, but not without one last attempt to get them to stay. Man, Princess Peach is terrifying. After freeing themselves from the flowers, there's nothing standing between the bros and Reclusa, so it's time for the final showdown. Reclusa has taken the initiative to face them first and has gotten them easily surrounded. Unable to take on all of Reclusa's minions, all hope seems to be lost, at least until Bowser shows up and blows a ton of them away, giving Mario and Luigi a chance to break through and chase down Reclusa. This first part of the fight is a bit of a gimmick, but I actually really like it. Reclusa is running away and and his flowers are shooting fire and ice at the bros. While chasing him, they need to counter all of those attacks, and once they catch up to him, charge a bro bomb to knock him down so they can fight him properly. Once he's down, you can tell that he's getting a little desperate. He retreats into the solitary and fuses with it, becoming Weeping Reclusa, and the pressure from the gloam he emanates is too much for anyone to withstand, so the bros fall. With no one left to help, Connie braves the gloam and, using her bonding can, uses the remaining power it contains to give the bros enough strength to fight, and revitalized, take on Weeping Reclusa. This part of the fight is pretty much the inverse of the previous one, starting with a standard battle against some enemies and ending with the chase section. Once the bros make their way into Weeping Reclusa, we get the actual final battle. This is another really great fight, especially once Reclusa has broken out of his core, and he gets more and more deranged as the fight goes on. Eventually he does go down, and knowing that he's defeated, he apologizes for all the pain he's caused and shows some real remorse. No, of course not, he's lying, and since he's not giving up, the bros give him one last beatdown. In his final moments, he has one last thing to say. Ugh, people, he like me for real. And with that, the day is saved, Reclusa is gone, and the world can finally go back to the way it was. With everyone together on Shipshape Island, we learn what's going to happen. The Great Conductor wants to send Mario and co back to the Mushroom Kingdom, but he doesn't have enough power left, so the only way he'll be able to do it is while Concordia is being brought back together. This means that the bros will never really get to see what Concordia fully looks like in its prime, and not only that, the people of Concordia won't be able to celebrate its unification with their new friends. So, after saying goodbye to everyone, Shipshape moves to the center of the world, the Unitree is restored, the islands reconnect, and the Great Conductor, using this surge of power, sends the Mushroom Kingdom group back home, but not before Connie gifts the bros a Unitree sapling of their own. And that was Mario and Luigi Brothership. Man, I had a ton of fun with this game, and as a revival of the Mario and Luigi franchise, I am more than satisfied with it. It has a ton of great ideas, some very interesting mechanics, and it tells a story that is far more earnest and heartfelt than anything we've seen in the series to date. However, it does have more than its fair share of problems. Some of the new mechanics aren't as tight as they should be, it doesn't take advantage of its world for character and enemy designs nearly as much as it could have, and of course, the pacing is pretty awful at times. Honestly, this is a 25 to 30 hour game that takes 40 to roll credits on, and as fun as the gameplay is, because it really is, it feels like they were trying to hit a completion time minimum, and while that is an issue emblematic of gaming in general nowadays, that doesn't really make it any less of an issue. Brothership just comes across as a game that lacks polish. Like, one more year of development could have easily smoothed off all of these rough edges and resulted in a game that could very easily stand as one of the best games in the series, but I guess not every game gets to be Tears of the Kingdom. As it is, it'll probably end up in the top half of the Mario and Luigi series rankings for me, but I have a hard time believing that it'll go above that point. That being said, if anybody was on the fence about trying it out, worried about the worst case scenarios, and thinking that it might be a betrayal and not do the series any justice, I personally think that it absolutely does do the series justice, and any fan of the Mario and Luigi games should definitely give it a shot, because if you manage to push past some of its rougher edges, there really is a lot to love underneath. It's far from perfect, and it has a lot of issues that I could see as deal breakers for many people, but it has a lot of heart, and many of its mechanics and ideas really are great. If this is just a first attempt at a new era for Mario and Luigi, I think they're definitely off to a good start here. If they can just tighten up the pacing and realize that a Mario RPG doesn't need to be as long as a Final Fantasy game, I think the team at Acquire can do something really great with this series. But until then, I guess we'll just have to wait and see where this ship sails. Thank you all so much for watching. And just before I end the video, I want to thank my amazing paid Patreon members, R.A. Miller, Louis G, Nick Ulrich, Adora Shark, James Fish, Drawing and Stuff Artist, Ryan Powell, Lucky Wonderfish, Creeping Briar, Matthew Lorigan, Dom, Benjamin Iliff, Parker P. Allen, and Ashad Mia. You're all the best, thank you so much.